It had been a day of great excitement. Katie found out that even though you want to wear a pretty ribbon, your hair may not let it stay in. Orby discovered that a bow tie can tickle, and they both learned that only so many people can use a bathroom at the same time. It was a very special evening because Katie and Orby were going out with Mom and Dad to see a play. It would be in a big theater with lots of seats and an orchestra. In the car, Mom told them that they were to do their very best to sit quietly and not to wiggle around. The two friends nodded. They knew how to sit. It was all very exciting. When they went in through the great big brass doors, Katie and Orby could barely keep from shouting with joy. But they did. Soon they were in their seats. In front of them was a huge red curtain. It went up so high, Katie could hardly see the top of it. Mom said that the play was starring a man named Nelson. That meant he was the main actor. Mom knew Nelson because she was friends with his sister. All of a sudden, the lights went out, and music started to play. Orby bopped up and down in his seat. He loved it, but Mom put her hand on Orby's knee to remind him that he needed to sit still. He turned his bops down to the tiniest nod of his head, and Mom smiled at him. Well, the play was full of songs and dancing and a funny story about a man who wasn't very nice. Then he learned that being nice was important. It was especially important if he wanted to have friends. And by the end of the play, he was really nice and was surrounded by all kinds of new friends he'd made. Katie and Orby loved the play. It made them laugh and cheer. Everybody clapped, and the two friends stood up to show the actors that they thought they'd done a good job telling the story. And when it was over, Mom had a surprise for Katie and Orby. They were going to go backstage and meet Nelson. Orby wondered what backstage was. Well, I'd better tell you that Orby couldn't keep his excitement inside any longer. He ran right up a wall and flipped over just like he'd seen someone do in the play. And he landed right in Dad's arms. Orby apologized. It's just that he was so excited. Mom patted his hand. She understood. A man in a green coat opened the door and let the family in. He pointed to Nelson's room down the hall. There were people walking every which way. Some were in costume and some were from the audience. Everybody was happy. Mom and Dad led the two friends down the hall to a room. They knocked on the door. When Nelson opened the door and invited them in, Orby was speechless. He just looked at Nelson without blinking. Nelson smiled. He was so glad to meet them. His sister had told him all about Katie and Orby, and now he could get to know them himself. They sat in Nelson's dressing room. He told funny stories about Mom when she was little. Katie laughed, but Orby really laughed. He edged over to Nelson and was soon sitting on his lap. Orby stared up into Nelson's handsome face. He felt like he had discovered the most amazing person in the whole world. Nelson talked on as Orby hugged him, and Nelson did hug him back, but to tell you the truth, it was getting hard for Nelson to breathe. Dad walked over and picked Orby up. He sat down with him and held him on his lap. Orby didn't even seem to notice. He was absolutely spellbound by Nelson. Katie was starting to think Orby wasn't feeling very well. But I have to explain that Orby was seeing Nelson as the character in the play, not the real person in front of him. He was seeing the grouchy man with no friends who learned to be wonderful. Orby inched off Dad's lap again and over to Nelson. Now, Nelson didn't mind. People stopped him all over the place asking for his autograph. An autograph was when he wrote his name on a piece of paper, and he was used to people staring at him. Orby crept up on his lap again and touched his face. Nelson smiled at Orby. He knew that because Orby had seen him on stage, he felt he was someone special, so he thought he'd better explain. He told Orby that pretending to be someone else on the stage was his job. Just as Mom and Dad had jobs, acting was his. If he was good at it and made people laugh, that was everything to him. But really, he was just an ordinary person, like Mom and Dad. Orby looked over at Dad. Dad looked pretty ordinary compared to the amazing Nelson. Mom took Orby's hand and told Nelson they'd better get going. Katie gave Nelson a huge hug and told him she loved his play. Everybody gave hugs. When it was Orby's turn, he grabbed onto Nelson's leg and didn't want to let go. And I have to tell you that Katie was a little annoyed with Orby. And that was pretty unusual because he was her very best friend. On the way home, Orby slumped down in his seat. He missed Nelson already. It took Mom, Dad, and Katie 2 days to help Orby feel better. Katie dressed up as different characters and did little plays for her friend. He did the same for her, and as you can guess, Orby discovered the difference between acting and being yourself. Soon he decided that he really didn't know Nelson at all. He felt he knew the man in the play, but now he knew Nelson was just pretending to be that person. The next time Nelson was in town, they all went out for dinner. As they sat at the table, Orby looked at him and felt like he was a wonderful person. Then he looked at Dad and felt the same thing. Everybody was happy to see Orby back to normal. And he was. He realized Nelson was nothing like the man in the play. He discovered that Nelson was a great family friend, and Orby loved him dearly. But he loved Nelson the same way he loved his friends. And I guess you can imagine, Nelson was very glad of it. And I hope that if you see or meet a star, you'll remember Nelson. He was not the person in the play, but was pretending to be that person. Acting is a job like any other, except that luckily we all get to enjoy it. Katie and Orby and you.
Did you know? The native peoples of the West Coast use totem poles to show their heritage, to tell stories, and to remember people no longer in the community. Sometimes, people are represented by animals, stacked one on top of the other, carved into a log. That brings a whole new meaning to a family tree.